Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hi, this is Rebecca Buchanan, host of New Books Network, New Books and Popular Culture. And today I'm here with Mel Stanfill, who is the author of Fandom is Ugly, Networked Harassment and Participatory Culture. Mel, thanks for being here with me today.
Thanks for having me.
Could you start out by just kind of like giving an overview, telling us sort of how this book on fandom and fandom being ugly came to be?
Well, I sort of kept accidentally trying to write it while I was supposed to be writing my previous book. Every time I would be going to a conference and it would be a fan studies related conference. And so I would want to have a fan studies topic. I kept coming back to these moments, these flashpoints that had recently happened where fans had been terrible in some fashion, right? So there was I was invited to give a presentation about youth media, and I was thinking about the case of The 100, which is a television show that's sort of aimed at a young adult audience on the CW. It's not on anymore. And they had killed off a lesbian character, and the fans like went, very intensely in reaction to that. In some ways that was activism, and in some ways that was harassment. And so I just kept having these moments where I would get drawn into thinking about where are um, the points of friction and contestation in fandom and media fandom, um, and also things that felt fanish to me but weren't, right? So I was watching the January 6th riot, I was like, this is about having really intense feelings about this guy, and it's not about policy, and it's not about having a vision for the government. It's because they really love Donald Trump, right? And so it just sort of I kept trying to write it and kept, having pieces of it. And then I was finally, I finished my previous book and was able to jump in and write this one.
Well, and you start out by kind of saying that you really had to think about this idea of ugly fandom, that there are many people who have sort of talked about like anti-fandom and different things, but for you, that just wasn't kind of capturing what you wanted, how you wanted to define this. So before we jump in, because you kind of then look at sort of seven different sort of case studies. So before we kind of jump in and highlight those, can you talk a little bit about just coming to that idea of what it means, what ugly fandom meant for you, and how that situates in fan studies?
So partially Fandom is Ugly is a internal fan studies inside joke. It also works on other levels, but in 2007, there was an edited volume called Fandom Identities and Communities, something like that, by Gray, Sandvoss, and Harrington were the editors. And they were talking about waves of fan studies, and they identified the first wave as fandom is beautiful, right? And the sort of in the face of understanding fans as passive dupes for culture and obsessive weirdos, and that sort of framework that was very current in the late 80s and into the early 90s, there was pushback from fans who were themselves academics wanting to say, this is cool, these are people resisting culture, they are imagining otherwise, they are making things queer. And there was a lot of focus on all of the things that were wonderful and amazing. And that, in many ways, set the foundation for what fan studies was. There's been a lot of, it's often been very celebratory. It's often been focusing on the membership or the fandoms of which the scholars are members, right? So they're like, my fandom is the coolest thing ever. And as a journal editor, I'm often like, okay, you can start there, but that's actually not an argument. Um, that's a topic, right? And so there's been movement back and forth, but and then arguments for and against, but I wanted to sort of turn it on its head. And the phrasing of fandom is ugly came from that. But in terms of thinking about, well, it's not anti-fandom, it's not toxic fandom, it's not, I had a term in a previous work, reactionary fandom. It's not any of those things because ugly is bigger, right? It's the umbrella that helps hold together things that are different but related. But for example, anti-fandom is when people are really opposed to a particular text or celebrity. Um, but the things I'm looking at often are they really love something and therefore they're being awful, right? And it's not about opposition. Toxic fandom, I feel like toxic has become, it has kind of come and gone in the time that I have been writing this book. It's not used as widely anymore, but it's so widely used that it's lost all meaning. Just so it does describe the sort of harmfulness, but it doesn't get much more specific than that. And then reactionary fandom is when fandom meets reactionary politics. And that's certainly part of what I talk about in some of the case studies. But it's not the only thing. There are people who are sort of self-identified progressives who are doing these kinds of harmful behaviors. And so none of those really got the full picture of what I was looking at and the ways that we need to look at a series of things that don't necessarily seem alike in order to understand this broader formation in this moment that we're in.
Yeah, and I really appreciate because you do have this sort of broad base of what you look at, and it's the we'll get into it later on. But I really appreciated the critical race theory, right? Like looking at that as like and connect because you start with comics and comic fandom, right? So let's start like you start with thinking about you start with Comic Gate and then we move all the way down to like critical. So I was like, yes, you can see like all the multiple ways in which there is some ugliness. Yes. And like you said, even with people who love something very much, there's some ugliness in fandom. So can we talk a little bit about, so you start with Comic Gate. Can you talk a little bit about Comic Gate and that sort of what you were, that sort of, I'm calling them all case studies, but because it's Friday and my brain. But can you talk a little bit about Comic Gate and what you're seeing in that?
Well, I mean, the first couple of case studies, Comicsgate being one of them, were things that were like really obviously fanish and really obviously ugly to sort of situate people into the kinds of things I was talking about before I moved towards some of the things that might be a little bit harder for people to follow me in the argument, right? And so, Comicsgate is a uh movement, I guess we would say. Is it a movement, like a social movement in an activist sense? Is it a harassment campaign? It's kind of all of those things. So, but it's a group of people who were very upset by and felt left behind by the diversification of comics that started to happen in the mid 2010s, and a sense that they were, turning their backs on their longtime fans who loved them so much, um, and so, part of what I argue in that chapter is that they're not wrong, that the straight white male fans have been decentered, but they are wrong to say it's the fault of people of color and women and queer people, right? It's the fault of capitalism, right? There needs to be an expansion to a broader audience. There needs to be, the never-ending quest for yet more customers and yet more sales. That is what is pushing people to produce a wider variety of comics in this era. And it's all been kind of a pendulum in some ways that it got, there were many titles that were released in an era and some of them failed. And so then there was a decrease in the amount of diversity and, the sort of back and forth. But overall, it has been a move toward in the comics industry toward, having a wider variety of titles to target a wider variety of audiences. But this fandom was very angry about this. They engaged in harassment campaigns of writers. They engaged in harassment campaigns of fans. They did Kickstarters to produce their like traditional comics. So they were doing activist things, they were doing creative things to like make their own comics and state their vision of the world, but it was all really based in being angry about the changes they had seen in this thing that they loved.
Yeah, and I'm gonna skip around a little with the chapter wise because I mean, you see this in other ways, but I think that also comes out what you were talking, like the capitalism, right? And like that fans want to have a little more control than they can. And you mentioned earlier, but like when you talk and look at the 100, right? And what the fans kind of did and they pushed against in trying to in the frustration of their character being killed off. So can you talk a little bit about that in that chapter too? Because I feel like there is a bit of connection there, right? And what you're talking about between that idea of, I feel like often it's just like, it's capitalism, folks. Like it's not, or like, cause like if a character or if an actor has, another role or something that they need to do. So can you talk a little bit about that too, and what was going on there?
Yeah, I mean, they are similar in the sense that it is a um, organized campaign of fans against media industries as a really significant part of what they were doing in both of those cases. And so in the case of the 100, they were, th it is true that those fans had been sort of strung along and they were trying, the showmakers were trying to convince them to keep watching, even though they knew they were going to kill this character that the fans really loved, or this group of fans really loved. And so there was like legitimately bad behavior on the part of the people making that TV show. And there was, at the time, there had been um a rash of killing off lesbian or bisexual, like queer women characters across a whole bunch of shows at the same time. Like everyone made the same artistic choice, back to back. And so it really, that group of fans felt kind of under attack, or they felt like their representation was being taken in a really, dramatic fashion. But in some ways, again, it was standard activism. They were trying to sort of pressure the advertisers. They were trying to appeal to the network to rein in this showrunner and make him, be more responsive to fans. But there was also harassment, right? There was just mass tweeting at this guy. There was sometimes anti-Semitism toward him. There were, ways of responding that were very intensely emotional, very angry, that were not, hey, this is not cool because of this representational, activist reason. And so to think about, it's both of those things at the same time, right? And so there has been a lot of attention, or at least there, a handful of articles about the fan activist side of that and the ways that they had, that coordinated, I wrote one of them, and that it was interesting that they were so successful in trying to leverage the industry's value systems, the kinds of things that, like, trending topics on Twitter at that point in time meant a lot for ratings. And so they were able to kind of reverse engineer that and turn that back around. And that was a really cool activist thing. But there was also all of this other side that people had not really talked about. And that in the context of this book seemed really important to be like, this is a group of people who are ostensibly progressive. These are people who are arguing in favor of queer representation in television, but they are doing this thing that looks exactly like Comicsgate. And they are doing this thing that looks exactly like Gamergate before it, right? And that this, I am very angry about a change in my media, and therefore I'm going to engage in a large scale reaction that is hostile. Kind of looks the same, even when the topic is different.
So, and along those lines, you also then look at sort of, I don't know how shifting this is, but like you think about like slash fiction, right? So thinking about how fans participate in some of these, and often they are more comic based or shows or show, right? Like, so can you talk? Because I thought it would, like, I really appreciated how you kind of pushed on slash, right? We often think about slash as being this way to, and I will just say, being a part or appreciating the fandom that is supernatural, like we're often like, there's often this push on supernatural to make, right? Like, so can you talk about though some problematic things you're seeing with Slash and how there is some normativity in that?
Absolutely. And I think that, the the ways that in the case I was just talking about, the 100, they were really focused on having this queer lady, in the show, and um but the ways that fans of color had been telling them this show is racist for a long time, but they didn't care because they had their white lady couple, right? Is really kind of indicative of the things that I picked up in the Slash chapter, where um, this is part of one of the main arguments of the sort of fandom is beautiful model, right? Is that um, resisting texts and making them queer and imagining the world otherwise, and this narrative that we have. And I'm like, yes, but right. And so yes, it is transgressive in some ways to imagine straight men characters as queer and as in love with one another. But when it is gender normative white middle class men, it's like right up against the edge of the norm, right? It resembles in a lot of ways what would be considered normative. And particularly when it is predominantly women, and it is predominantly women who are attracted to men, although they're not heterosexual. They don't identify, they're like often like het or bi, right? Or queer, but whose attraction includes men. I did research on that, on the demographics. And so, the stereotype that it's straight women turns out not to be true, but they are often women who are attracted to men, among other genders. That, having stories where they are eroticizing men, not that non-normative, right? It resembles the expectations in some ways. And so then we see, okay, these are stories that focus on domesticity and marriage and child rearing and these things that are very much what is expected. And the only difference is that they have swapped out a man for, one of the partners. And so, these stories are very disproportionately white. They often will focus only on white men characters. They will ignore men of color that are in the same texts. There's really not a lot of attention to various, characters that are all there and available to be played with like paper dolls, but they don't ever seem to. And then similarly, to throw back to the 100 example, femme slash or stories that are about love between women are really underrepresented. There are very few, it's single digit percent of the overall, number of stories in any given fandom or in fan archives overall. And so that's a thing in and of itself. But then also, one of the things that's really common, particularly in younger generations, is a drive to only think things are valid to be fans of if they actually appear in the text, right? That like, oh, we love this relationship and therefore you should make it canon, or you should, and that's a fanish term for in the official text itself. And the idea that you're not allowed to do it unless the media maker has said that it's real, according to the media maker's standards, is really giving up a lot of the power of fandom that traditionally, was celebrated. And I argue that that's a form of homonormativity. It's a form of letting straight standards determine queer joy and pleasure that I really wanted to point out, that it's fans giving away their power. It's fans limiting the possibilities of their own spaces and really sort of conforming with norms and reproducing power structures rather than contesting them.
Right. And you continue to kind of look when you also have a chapter that looks at like right? You call it the anti-war, right? Looking at this because you sort of continue to push at this idea of like participating in fandoms and participating in fan fiction and what, yes, like I love how you're kind of like thinking about like what are fans taking away from themselves, right? Or not allowing themselves to do when they kind of push some of this fandom or this ugly fandom. So can you talk a little bit about the anti-war and what in that chapter a little?
Yeah, so that's also a title that's a like, in joke. But that one is maybe a little bit wider known. There was something called the feminist sex wars, right, that happened where there were pro pornography feminists and anti-pornography feminists who were arguing against each other about which thing was really more feminist, to be for it or against it. And much the same formation is happening currently right now in fandom. It's ongoing. And there's a group of fans that are often called antis, which originated from in the first place people using anti as a tag, as a prefix, like I am anti this, in like Tumblr and other kinds, and Twitter, as a way to, as metadata, as a way to signal, to the people that were part of their group, and to not talk to the people that liked the thing, right, as a way to separate out the groups. But anti has come to be a noun and sort of stand on its own. And antis are very concerned that the kinds of things we see represented in fiction are encouraging those things to happen in reality. So they're concerned when there's a story that there is somebody underage having sex, it is encouraging pedophilia. When there's a story that includes sexual assault, it is encouraging sexual assault. And so there is a sense that in order to make the world a better place, and to make fan community safer for everyone, those types of stories should be banned. But then, we might think about that in one way or another, and agree or disagree, but then the decision they have made on the basis of having that opinion is that anyone that posts those kinds of stories should be harassed until they stop. Right. And so even if we say, oh, should we be thoughtful about representation? Might there be, concerns about whatever, treating things lightly? The way that this then gets picked up and used is as harassment and doxing, releasing people's private information. People have had severe mental health crises as a result of just sort of ongoing harassment for fiction, right? Stories they have written. And so that's one side of the anti-wars. The other side of the anti-wars are the sort of anti-antis or pro-shippers. And ship comes from relationship, right? People who advocate relationships between characters. And it's historically been used in the context of a particular fandom. So the supernatural case, right? The Destiel shippers, the people who like those characters together. But the pro shippers are really harshly rejecting they see this as censorship, right? They see this as trying to constrain what is acceptable, as blowing things out of proportion, seeing fiction, like not understanding the difference between fiction and reality, and sort of, I'm just writing a story. It's not going to hurt anyone. Please leave me alone. But really refusing any of the potentially valid questions raised in the anti-perspective of like, what does it mean to represent these things? And are you doing it thoughtfully? And is this, do we have what do we owe to each other within fan communities to try to make it an inclusive place? But one of the things I really noticed as I was getting in, and my data set for that was a bunch of tweets. I just sort of looked for the word antis on Twitter to just try to not be bound to any given fandom and its own specific concerns. And Twitter was still able to be scraped at that point in time, and it was still called Twitter and all of that. But the ways that it was only ever about questions of representation around sexuality. There were never questions about what does it mean to post a racist story, right? And both sides would sort of throw these sort of kind of bad faith arguments at each other to be like, well, you're, in addition to liking this content with underage sexuality, you are a racist, or in addition to censoring me, you are a racist. And it was this weird sort of like ungrounded in any real discussion of like, what does it mean to represent characters of color in dehumanizing ways, or what does it mean to refuse to represent characters of color at all? To throw back to the previous chapter, like those questions were not getting asked. And so that was something that was emergent from the data that I didn't go in there expecting to see, but I kept seeing all these mentions of race that were just like a laundry list of like things to care about and never really, the center of the conversation, except very rarely from self-identified fans of color who were like, guys, what about this other issue? You're getting rid of, or you're refusing to consider this other thing that is somewhat related but doesn't really function the same way at all.
Yeah, so because I skipped over your second chapter, right? Well, I mean, I just moved around. So like because you continue to talk about race towards the end, but I want to you also look at more political and cultural, right? The other one. So first, can we talk about Bernie?
Yes.
Because I think it's, and thinking about Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, and just like I appreciate too in that where you talked about again that idea of like you are owed like the fans think they're owed something. So can you talk about what you were seeing with kind of the Bernie Sanders fandom and and politics as fandom, right? Or yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And so that was, another one of the chapters that's early in the book where I'm trying to sort of say, we might be able to see how this is a fandom and we can see how this is ugly and this can get people on board with this before I sort of go in these directions that are harder to connect. And so, I was originally going to write a chapter about Elizabeth Warren and the snake emoji. That like there was a long period of time, and I haven't looked recently since I finished the book, where people would reply to mentions of Elizabeth Warren or her own tweets with just emojis calling her a snake. And so I just collected a whole bunch of tweets about that. And as I got in there, it's all bound up in loving Bernie Sanders as much as they hate Elizabeth Warren and seeing them as somehow rivals and in sort of opposition to each other, despite their quite similar political views. And there is a sense of, I call it sort of like fanish magical thinking or fanish conspiracy thinking, where they just think, well, obviously, if Elizabeth Warren had not been in the election in 2020, then Bernie Sanders would be president right now. And skipping over every step of the would have had to happen in between. Like he didn't win the primary, he didn't, he probably wouldn't have won the general. Like there's lots of things that like, but it's this, they are fixating on Elizabeth Warren as the figure of the thing that has taken away their imagined utopia. And the sort of that they were owed a Sanders presidency, and that has been taken away from them. And also the ways that as soon as anytime that Sanders is like, collaborating with the Biden administration, they would also have blowback about that of like, no, those are the bad guys. Bernie is turning on us, and the politics were really kind of incoherent. When I was looking at the political statements they were making, they were like Medicare for all, but they were also like, yay, Elon Musk. And I'm like, I don't, those are, I don't understand how you're a socialist who loves billionaires. There's something in here that does not compute. But it really was, working through it and looking at it, it's about having a contestatory relationship to the mainstream, or, seeing themselves as outsiders, and having that sense of politically incorrectness, or politically resistant, or not part of what is considered the center, is kind of driving it. And so it produces these really strange bedfellows in terms of who is doing that. But that it's supposed to be about Warren, and it really became about this much bigger political phenomenon that was centered around this emoji. And I also just recently wrote a blog post promoting this book for the NYU Press blog, and it was about Kamala Harris and the emojis that people are using around her, and how we're seeing really similar patterns of using an emoji to signal your allegiance or your antipathy for a candidate is become really part of a lot of political discourse on, at least on Twitter and some other platforms. And it's very interesting. And also, it's not deliberation about policy. It's about having feelings about candidates and attachment to them as celebrities, right?
So what's the top Kamala Harris emoji?
So there's a couple, and they're kind of pointing opposite directions. So there's Kamala Harris tells an anecdote about her mother saying, "Don't act like you just fell out of the coconut tree," meaning recognize who came before you, and that you have people made things possible for you to be where you are. And some people were using the coconut with or without the palm tree. Right, but coconut is also a slur for brown people who are white on the inside, who are insufficiently dedicated to their racial identity, right? And so there was a fight about this, of people being like, "What? Who hadn't heard the anecdote, were like, what are you saying? This is racist." And the other one is the watermelon emoji, right, which has been being used on platforms for months in support of Palestine, because supporters of Palestine were pretty sure they were being shadow banned, that they were not being allowed to use the actual Palestinian flag. And the watermelon has all the same colors, right? And so people were using it. But watermelon is also an offensive racial stereotype about Black people, right? And so there are these different emojis, some of which are support, some of which are contestation, that mean multiple things to different audiences, producing these really these points of conflict as they get used on social media.
Yes, I have to say that I in reading your book was thinking like they get to look at a lot of like emojis and how emojis play out
Mhm.
And I was like, this is great. So
Spare a thought for the typesetter who had to put all those in the
I know,
book.
I was wondering, I was thinking about that. I was like, oh. So you move like, and so thinking about elections and thinking about that, you move into sort of your last two chapters are looking at some more cultural war things. So can you first talk about like hashtag Mug Club and what that was and what was kind of going on with that, sort of what you were seeing in that kind of fandom or fan experience?
Yeah. Well, I first became aware of that. I was doing a project with a student who was interested in YouTube, and we were looking at contestation over YouTube. And in that context, it was contestation over um, like trying to protect children who appeared in videos by just automatically demonetizing and removing comments from them so that people couldn't do anything weird, shady with it, which hit a lot of family channels and people who were sort of like doing things that were not nefarious, right? And so there was contestation over what we called governance washing on YouTube. And so we were looking for like what might the follow-up be. We didn't end up writing it, but we came across this example of what was known as the Vox adpocalypse in 2019. So there's this YouTuber, Steven Crowder, who had for a long period of time been spending, portions of his show making fun of a particular gay Latino journalist and attacking him for being gay and attacking him for being Latino and, calling him a socialist and all the sorts of things. And that this was finally the journalist Carlos Maza got fed up and was like, YouTube, this guy is violating your terms of service. He is using this platform that he has that you are letting him monetize, that you are letting him make money by defaming me every week, right? And so YouTube, he raised a stink, and he and his followers raised a stink, and then YouTube reacted by demonetizing Crowder's channel. And then Crowder launches this hashtag called Vox Adpocalypse because Maza at the time was working for the outlet Vox. There had been an adpocalypse a few years earlier where a bunch of advertisers had discovered that their ads were running alongside beheadings and Klan rallies, and they were like, you don't have anything in place to protect our brand value. And so they had withdrawn ads, and YouTube had changed their policies. And so it was a sort of argument that this is like the previous adpocalypse, but it has been caused by this outlet Vox that Maza worked for. And this is one of the largest case studies I have. There were like 130,000 tweets. And I, with the help of my colleague John Murray, who helped me figure out the scraping, I got them all. Right. So I was looking at the entirety of this 130,000 tweets and the patterns in it. And so the patterns were, there's a bunch of stuff going on talking about free speech, and that is for another project that may or may not ever happen. You plan to write something, it doesn't always happen. But this thing that I kept noticing were these moments of referencing being a fan of Crowder and referencing, I have signed up for your subscription mug club where, you pay a fee for the year or monthly and you get as your part of your membership, you get a mug with the logo on it. And one of the things he did as part of this rallying cry to his fans was to give a discount on the mug club. And so there were all of these tweets where people were announcing, I'm your fan, I'm going to support you, or I just joined mug club, or these sorts of things referencing this subscription service and turning it into an identity, right? I'm a mug clubber, I'm mug club for life. And so it was, in some ways, it was a boycott, right? As the opposite of a boycott, that they were going to spend their money to indicate support of him. But it was also about their own identity and their own sense that if he can't make money by making fun of this guy, free speech has been destroyed, right? And this really expansive sense of not only, the government didn't come and take him away, and he didn't get sued, and YouTube didn't delete his channel. They just prevented him from making money. But there was this underlying sense that not only is there a right to speak, there's a right to make money speaking that was sort of built into this. That was the underlying logic of why people rallied to his defense in these really fanish ways.
So, again, capitalism, right? It all looks amazing. I shouldn't be shocked anymore, but I always am. And you end with I really appreciated how you looked at and thought about critical race theory, right? And this sort of like anti-fandom of critical race theory, because like I was like, oh, I appreciate this framing. Like this is kind of the ways in which I've been trying to like, how do you think through this and how do you think about that? Especially I do like teacher education a lot, like so thinking about like how do we talk about this? And this really, I mean, it kind of could fit in with DEI. But so yeah, can you talk about sort of critical race theory and what you were doing with that?
Yeah, well, partially that was one of the chapters that happened as I was writing the book, is I was watching, so in 2021, this moral panic around the term critical race theory kicks off and it's in some ways it's astroturfed, right? It's not organically from the bottom up. It is pushed by a number of figures, conservative figures with significant followings like Christopher Rufo, but it really catches the imagination of a group of people, and people start showing up to school board meetings and yelling about this um, and yelling about how their children have been harmed by critical race theory, which they don't even know what it is, right? It's just like it's the boogeyman, right? And I describe it as the every boogeyman. Like it is whatever it needs to be to get people upset in a particular moment. It's a text, it's an empty signifier, it's something people have feelings about in a way that doesn't make a whole lot of sense for like this is a school of legal theory that was developed in the 1970s and 80s, and um it's not taught in elementary schools because it's a legal theory that's taught in law schools. It's very strange, but it is exactly like DEI, and actually DEI is the new term that is doing that exact same work for the exact same people. But this, thinking about it, is that this is an interpretation of a text. This is, what I talk about as, so we talked about canon earlier, right? The official text. Fanon is a set of interpretations of a text that fans sort of accept as true, even though it's not in the text. And so everything that's circulating around CRT and this panic is Fanon. It's like things that bear no relation to the actual thing itself. It's just about the sort of things that people imagine are happening or get upset about. And I particularly talk about it as anti-fanon, right? It's a set of things that they believe that are not in the text itself, that are in opposition to it, and that are around disliking it. And what I ultimately argue is that people got all of these feelings about CRT because they knew they weren't supposed to have feelings about whiteness, right? These are people who have, like self-identified white supremacists are allowed to say, I love being white. But most other people recognize that will not be received well. Even if they may or may not want to say it, but they know they shouldn't regardless. And so this sense of, that this is a harm that is done to my children. The children are implicitly white, right? And so white children are harmed by learning about racism. And white people are harmed by having to know that racism is a thing that exists. And so it's really like it's refracted through this text, and it's about feelings, it's about identity, it's about public feelings collectively interpreting this text together in a way that has, again, no relation to the thing itself. And so it's structured like a fandom, right? It is structured in the same way of the other things that I talk about that are much more rooted in media, because this was mediated. People would hear about it on Facebook, they would see it on the news. Nobody ever picked up Kimberly Crenshaw and read her work, right? Nobody ever picked up, Derek Bell and these other people and read their work. It was just what they heard that it was, and they're reacting to these interpretations that are circulating. And but it had really powerful material effects, right? People were harassed, people were fired, curriculums were changed. That these are to think that like, oh, it's just feelings, it doesn't matter, it's just a text, it doesn't matter. It has really material impacts on people's lives. And as a result, I had tried to take this version of it as an article and sort of take it around, and like reviewers did not like it because they were just like, this is trivializing the harms of this. But I really don't think I did. But it's just like, why do people care so much about this thing? And you can't understand it without understanding this sort of its feels about a text.
So you've written this, right? Like, so what are you hoping like, I think some of what you just said there gets at this, but like this idea of really thinking about like the ugliness, right? And ugly fandom. What do you want readers to really get from this? Like what direction, and maybe what direction do you think fandom is headed then, or an analysis of fandom is headed based on your work and your research?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've had, you know, as much as Twitter has had its flaws and its downfall and it's not as good as it used to be, when I've posted about this book, it has made its way into fan circles and fans themselves have been interested in reading it. And so I think that for fans who are seeing these sorts of really intense campaigns about things and they don't really understand what's happening and they might feel a little uncomfortable with it, but they don't really have the language to understand why it's making them uncomfortable, I think it could have, could be beneficial for them. And I'm not just saying that because my press wants this to sell to the general public. I think it could. But I think in terms of, fan studies itself, the baggage of the field having started from this really celebratory place is something that we're still dragging around. And a lot of people who are frustrated by that are just kind of giving up on fan studies and being like, this field is unsalvageable because it is so celebratory and so white and so all of these things. But I think by using fan studies approaches to look at culture wars topics and to look at, push the edges of what we consider in this way, um, I hope to show that these kinds of approaches actually are still really valuable to look at things that are not celebratory and to have approaches that are not celebratory and look at things that are terrible and ugly and still gain insight into what's happening with them and why they look the way they do when people don't seem to be behaving rationally. In some ways, they're not, right? They're just operating from feelings. And if we don't take that into account, we don't actually know what we're looking at.
So the book just came out, and so anything you want to promote, right? My final, anything that's going on with the book that you want people to know about or promote, anything you're working on, I'm sure it just came out, and so, but like anything else that you're coming down. So what? It's kind of self promotional. People are like, I'm done with everything, right? The book, like, where are you at with, yeah.
Well, I mean, the thing that you mentioned about the CRT panic NTEI is actually in some ways where my next book is going. And so my next book is looking at academics and academia as objects of fandom and anti-fandom. And so there's a whole chapter about the external political attacks on scholars and on institutions and all of the hearings that happened last fall about campuses and protests and all of the movements that are happening to sort of get rid of DEI, and sort of, again, treating it like the boogeyman, treating it as this thing that is evil and bad, and it doesn't matter what it actually is. It matters what people feel about it. And so I'm trying to live, practice what I preach and use fan studies to keep sort of pushing in those directions. So I'm hoping to have some pieces of that out soon, but that's where I'm going next. And yeah, I hope people like the book.
Awesome. So, Mel Sanfield, thanks for talking with me about Fandom is Ugly, Networked Harassment, and Participatory Culture.
Thanks for having me.